When we approach Genesis 1 with a wooden way of reading it, we are misreading the text. It's gonna lead us to places that the text itself isn't designed to go. When Genesis breaks faith when it's read wrong. Yeah, that's what we're talking about today on Whiskey and the Writings. I'm your host, Joe, and I'm so glad you're here. This channel is for the skeptic, the seeker, those who still believe, but maybe just not like they used to. It's a place for you to explore new thoughts and new ideas and concepts, all over a glass of whiskey or whatever drink you've got in front of you. Today, I'm drinking Keeper's Heart. This was a collaboration done with Sockeye Brewing. So this Irish American whiskey was finished over stout barrels over at Sockeye, and I'm wearing my Sockeye merch. Big fan of Sockeye Brewing here on Whiskey and the Writings. But that's what I'm drinking today. That's what I got in front of me. We always like to have a drink when we talk theology, and so whatever you have in front of you, pour your drink. Cheers. Let's get into it. Okay, folks, why Genesis breaks faith when we read it wrong. So if you've listened to any of my videos, you know that I love talking about Genesis. So part of what I'm building into this year is this way of reading the Bible that's thematically driven, meaning that we stop approaching reading the text, looking for something to help whatever circumstance I'm in at the moment, or trying to read the text and understand it for an answer book, but to actually respect and honor and take seriously these ancient writings that have been preserved, collected, and bound together in what we call our Bible. And to see that maybe more than an answer book, maybe more than a self-help book, that the Bible is actually driving towards one theme, and that theme begins in Genesis and ends in Revelation. And I've argued on this channel, and when I have conversations with friends about this topic, I've argued that Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are some of the most foundational parts of understanding the theme of the Bible. And so if I were to articulate, what I think the theme is, and again, this is my hypothesis, right? It's not simply my hypothesis. Others have argued this in various ways and in various forms. So it's not like I'm making up something that no one's ever heard before. But if it's new to you and you're going, Joe, what do you mean thematically, reading the Bible thematically? What I mean by that is that there is a meta-narrative that's happening in the text that's driving towards a specific point and a specific goal. And what I believe that point and goal is that the way of God ruling his creation, his good creation that he created, is what this is all about. And so what starts in Genesis 1 and 2 gets finished in Revelation 21, 22. It's this reality of God has always been about being with his creation, his people, on his creation, his good earth. And that's the way it was set up to go. It went wrong, obviously. You read Genesis chapter 3 and then all of the subsequent information that were provided in the text, and it's just one big mess that ultimately Jesus shows up on the scene to remedy, to fix, to show the way forward, to set that example, and then provide the means to actually accomplish it through his Spirit, leaves, sets his church in place to actually be the hands and feet of Jesus until the return of Jesus. And so is you just kind of mark the overall arcing theme of the Bible. The Bible's not about me going to heaven when I die or how to get to heaven when I die. That's not what the Bible's about. The Bible includes information about things like salvation and things like justification and the restoration of my own existence and humanity here on this earth. It contains elements about how to do that well and how to mess that up, and warnings and wisdom and how to live that out. But thematically speaking, the Bible is this overarching narrative that is leading us to the culmination of God ultimately restoring us back to the Genesis 1 and 2 creational good. Now, that is my hypothesis, right? So I know that there are those that would prioritize other aspects of the text to say that those are the most important things. There are those that would say that there is no thematic overview. These are all individual things, and I agree with all of that. That's the funny thing about this is when I um, when I listen to critical examination of the Bible, and I listen a lot of it because I'm fascinated with the way that the text came to be what we have today in our Bibles. I'm fascinated with who wrote what, and we're going to get into some of those key elements here in a little bit. But um, I think all of that can be true, and yet it still be inspired to be the thing that we have today. Like N.T. Wright will often say that the Bible that we have today is exactly what God wanted us to have. Over the course of Revelation, there were people who took texts, wrote new texts, edited, heavily edited, and redacted and changed text, compiled them together, and through the sharing of that compilation, these things became what we might call authoritative, as a binding document that communicates God to us, that we call our Bibles. I'm okay with all of that in the complexity that I know exists around it, and yet also can hold in my other hand to say I think it's inspired. That how this thing got to be the thing that we examine and read today, I can acknowledge that in the historical past, that might not have been the case. Obviously, things like different writings that are like, Kings and Chronicles, or, things like Lamentations, or even Ecclesiastes. These can be independent writings that are written for a specific context and purpose without any knowledge of a grander scale narrative that's being weaved together. That can happen, and God can also inspire certain things to be what they have become. So I'm okay with that. That stuff doesn't scare me. I know for some people who are in a process of really reworking their faith, these sorts of conversations can be really threatening. And then in church circles, these kinds of conversations can be very threatening because it can feel like it undermines something that we believe about the text to be true. And if if it's as complicated as I'm making it sound, then how can God be involved in that? And I would just argue that that why wouldn't we expect it to be this way? To think that the formation of the Bible is just this clean cut, dropped out of heaven, fully bound, 66 books, all that stuff without any errors, perfect in the way it was, the way it is. My belief in that is that that's an expectation we're putting onto the text, that the text itself doesn't actually communicate. What we see in the text when we read it is a very messy process of God and humans, God continually trying to work with the messy humans to bring about his good on the earth. It has always been a messy process. And so why would we expect it any less? And why would we expect that God wouldn't be okay with that? Like, so I say all that. I lay that foundation to say, the way that we come into the text, for me, there's a thematic overview. And so I call this reading the Bible thematically. And you're going to hear that a lot this year as we talk about the Bible and theology and all these sorts of conversations. But with that in mind, when we come to Genesis, there's a lot of conversations that have taken place over the centuries about what Genesis is, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And these aren't new conversations. These conversations have been happening, like I said, for centuries. There have been conversations about how to read these texts that have formed, from Western thought to Eastern thought. And, do we read it allegorically? Do we read it as literalism? How do we read these events? And how we read these events can actually shape what we believe about God, what God's up to, and if something new comes out that might challenge the way that I've read these opening chapters, it can actually break my faith. And there's been so many people that have walked away from the Bible because they can't reconcile in their mind what they've been told that Genesis 1 and 2 is, right? What they've been told it is, or what they've read it to be. And so I want to break that out a little bit and help you see that, number one, the writings in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 are no threat to what you believe about God. And actually, they're probably not at all what you think they are. And so, without further ado, how about we just get into it, right? Here's some thoughts. So I'm going to take another drink. Here we go. That was a big foundation to talk about this. I want to introduce a book to you that I have found extremely helpful. And I'll talk about another book that I found extremely helpful. So this is a book called Bridging the Testaments. And it's by George Athas. He is a professor and wrote this amazing book. I actually found out about this book. Where does he? Yeah, he's PhD, University of Sydney. He's the director of research and senior lecturer in Hebrew, Old Testament, and the early church history at Moore Theological College in Sydney, Australia. So that's who this is. I've never heard of him until I was watching a video by Carmen Imes, who shares her reading lists. So she has a YouTube video, you should go check it out, where she talks about books that she's been reading and reviews them. And so she brought up in one of her videos this book, Bridging the Testaments. It sounded fascinating to me. It was a book that she read when she was doing her graduate work at Wheaton College. And so she shared the book. I thought it was awesome. I put it on my list in Amazon, and my good friend Joel bought it for me for Christmas. And I'm telling you, it's such a great book. I'm bringing it up because, we're talking about Genesis, but I bring up Bridging the Testaments for a reason. Because there's some information in there that we'll get to in a second that is relevant to this conversation. But if you've ever wondered about that time period that Protestants kind of call the silent years, the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament, it is some of the most fascinating stuff and I think some of the most important stuff that if you want to understand what Jesus is talking about in the New Testament, you have to know what the conversation was leading up to Jesus. And the only way you're going to know that is by studying the history and the time of this intertestamental period. So just a huge thank you to Joel for getting it for me, and I encourage you to pick it up yourself. We're going to come back to that in a second. Another book that I want to encourage you to pick up or to look into, if you're curious about understanding Genesis 1 and 2, is a book. So I've mentioned these before, but it's John Walton. He is a professor at Wheaton College, and John Walton has written a handful of different books on understanding the ancient Near Eastern cultures and how understanding those cultures will actually help you understand the Bible and the conversations that's being had at the time that these texts are being written, that are very formative in really just not misreading what Genesis 1 and 2 are trying to do. And so there are, and I've linked to them in my show notes, those books. So I encourage you to go pick those up too. And so I'll be drawing from some of that literature as well. So kind of my two areas of you know, information that's helping contribute to this conversation is John Walton and George Athas. And of course, a number of teachers as well, like Tim Mackey and T. Wright, all have been formative in helping me be able to think through what Genesis 1 and 2 are actually doing. And so, that being said, here's the challenge, right? So there is what we might be able to label as like a very wooden way to read the Bible. And when I say a wooden way to read the Bible, I'm referring to reading these texts in a literalistic fashion, in a way that what that word says is what that word means as I understand the definition of that word in my day and in my time. There is and I call that a very wooden, a very rigid way to read the text. That's the word it says. That's what it means because I know the definition of that word. And if that's the approach you take, so when we're looking at Genesis, right, here's the critique. Genesis 1 uses words like day. It uses material, sun, moon, sea. So there's sky, there's fish, there's birds, there's animals. It's this material world that we live in. And when we see those words, we will begin to import into our brain our understanding of what a day is. A day is a 24-hour period, right? As the sun rotates, or we rotate around the sun. I almost said that one backwards. Okay, time for a quick pause. If Whiskey in the Writings has been helpful to you, there's a deeper layer of this conversation happening off of YouTube. Over on storiesoftov.com, Whiskey in the Writings has its own home. That's where I share extended reflections, behind-the-scene thoughts, and upcoming conversations that have never made it into these videos. It's also where you can sign up for our newsletter. No spam, no noise, just thoughtful writing, and a heads up on what's coming next. If you want to stay connected beyond the algorithm, head over to storiesoftov.com and sign up for the newsletter today. All right, let's get back into it. That's how we think of a day, right? And so it's easy for us to import that definition on the text. What we fail to understand when we do that is that we are doing something with language that can get problematic very quickly. Now, I'm not saying that the day, which I think is the Hebrew word olam, but that word day translated in English from Hebrew isn't an appropriate word to use. That very well is a great, one-for-one definition. However, it can be more nuanced than that. And how I understand day today might not be the same way they understood day back then. So we got to respect that. So we're dealing with English Bibles. And if you've thought through translation history at all, you know that we didn't start out with English, right? We started out with Hebrew and Greek. And over the course of time, Hebrew went into Aramaic, and then slowly Aramaic faded out, and Greek was the popular language, and it wasn't highbrow Greek; it was Koine Greek, it was common Greek, and then you go from Greek and you go into Latin, and then after Latin, you get into the Germanic languages that starts getting translated into, and so you have these histories of translation that you have to make choices. When you see something in Greek, you have to make a choice what that word means and what English word am I going to choose to help best represent what that word means in Greek. And so it gets complicated. So when we approach Genesis 1 with a wooden way of reading it, we are misreading the text. It's gonna lead us to places that the text itself isn't designed to go. Okay. The writer of Genesis 1 is not concerned with material origins, i.e., how did the sun get here? How did animals get here? this is where John Walton uses a turn of phrase that I've appreciated over the years. He says Genesis 1 is about how a house becomes a home. And if you've never heard me say that before, essentially what John Walton argues for in his writings on Genesis is that Genesis 1 is about a house that gets turned into a home. What do I mean by that? Well, a house has material elements to it that make it a house, right? So I used to work in construction in my summers through high school, and we would do framing. And I remember walking up to a house, and there's a foundation there that got laid, weeks before I got there. And then now that the foundation's there, we got to frame a house around it. And so you've got cement involved, you've got wood involved, you've got nails that are involved, you've got all these things, trusses for the roof, and then siding you got to put on. And then after all of that, you've got sheetrock, and you've got wiring and electrical and HVAC and roofing. And so all of these material things are what makes a house, right? And so you buy a brand new house, all of those material things are present and accounted for. But that house doesn't become a home until you move in and organize it. And so what I mean is that if you've ever been in a situation where you've seen an empty, brand new build, a brand new house, and you walk in and it's just empty and the walls are all white and it's bare and there's no life there, there's no color there, it's all just empty and nothing. You have to make decisions when you enter into that house. You have to decide where things are going to go. So for instance, where are we going to who's getting what bedrooms, right? Kids, okay, you're down the hall, second door on the left. We're going to take the master bedroom over here. And then boxes start coming in from the movers, and you've got boxes that got labels on them. That's a kitchen, and you designate these kitchen things go into the kitchen, and these sorts of things go into the bedroom. And, here's the computer stuff. It goes into the computer room. All of that is organizing and forming, and that house doesn't become your home until all of those things are in order and in place, and you have taken up residence within the house, right? So when Walton makes the argument that Genesis 1 is about a house becoming a home, what he's saying is that the writers aren't interested in the sheetrock and the foundation and the wood that was used and the paint and the shingles on the roof. Genesis 1 is not caring about those details. That's what we think it's about because it seems to talk about that. But more important than that, Genesis 1 is arranged to actually talk about space and filling spaces. And so in days 1, 2, and 3, you have all of these spaces that have been created. And then days 4, 5, and 6, you have things going into those spaces. And it all culminates at the very end on day 6 when humans take up residence on the earth. And that's the point of a house becoming a home. And so thematically speaking here, Genesis 1 isn't trying to tell us how old the earth is. Genesis 1 isn't telling us how long did it take for God to make the earth. I would argue that Genesis 1 has nothing to do with any of that. And so when we try to impose a scientific reading on Genesis 1, we actually have gone astray. We've gone off the path of what Genesis 1 is trying to do. We are actually imposing onto the text something that the text itself doesn't actually argue for. And that's where I go, we got to be careful when we do that. Now, could God make the earth in 6 days? Sure, I don't know. Who cares, right? Could God have taken billions of years to let this whole thing be what it is? Sure, why not? Who cares? Genesis 1 isn't even having that conversation. So when we try to have that conversation in Genesis 1, it can break our faith because if we read Genesis like that, it puts us in a box that actually can be detrimental to any challenges that we find in that box. What I mean by that, if you're taking Genesis 1 through the lens of a scientific reading, you have a lot of work to do to account and reconcile the things that we see in this earth. And that's a big conversation, right? So you might be listening to this and going, Joe, are you saying that you don't think the world was created in 6 days? I personally don't. And yeah, okay. I say I don't. I actually don't care. That is probably more accurate. It's like, I don't think it matters. Why does that matter? It's not proving anything. Like we want to get to this place in the Bible where we go, we got to prove it's true, as if we got to prove something to ourselves, or we got to prove something to someone else that, well, if it's not true, then I'm pretty dumb because I've been believing it. And so when I see some scientific thing about how old the earth is, and that runs against how I read Genesis 1, then I look stupid. And so now I got to prove myself to not look stupid, or I just walk away altogether. I'm just saying there's actually a different path, a better path that you can go down in reading Genesis that doesn't actually break your faith. When we read it thematically, we see something more beautiful at play in Genesis 1 than reading it through a scientific modern lens. And that beautiful message is that we serve a God, a creator God of the universe, that actually cares about us enough to arrange an ecosystem, a world, so that we have a home that we can actually be with God in. And so that's incredible. And that sets up, if we're reading it thematically, that actually sets up and is in line with what we see happening in the rest of the Bible. A God who so much cares about his creation and what he created that he wants to partner and be a part of it with us. And so you see that trend all the way through in the Old Testament leading up to Jesus, where Jesus comes, and in John's Gospel chapter 1, it talks about how God came to dwell, to tabernacle, to dwell among us. This is what God wants. And so Genesis 1 is actually showing us the heart of God. It's not telling us a scientific origin of everything. Who cares? What matters more isn't how things got here. What matters most, according to the Bible, is what we're doing with it now. And you see this repeated over and over and over again, that what we do here and now actually matters. Because God cares about this stuff and he wants to be a part of it with you. This sets up a whole new way to read the Bible, instead of trying to, understand all of these, like, okay, then a day is a 24-hour, and then we got to do some math, and then when was Noah, and then how did he live, and then let's do reverse engineer the scientific, and now we can know how old the earth is. Who cares? What really matters is that you have a God that cares about you enough to make a world for him to engage and dwell with you in, and to partner with you in. That's incredible. God loves you. God is chasing you. God wants to be with you. He does not want to abandon you. He is not some ruler that's just ready to pounce on you after every little mistake. What we see in Genesis 1 is a God who goes to great lengths just to hang out with us. That's super rad. That's super rad. So Genesis 1, right? So if we can change the framework of how we actually read Genesis 1, it actually opens us up and frees us from the debate of the scientific origins of the world. It frees us from it. We don't have to, who cares? We don't have to worry about it anymore. It actually doesn't matter, because that's not what it's trying to communicate. So I think I've driven that point home. When we get to Genesis 2, however, you see something very different. And I love these conversations, because over the centuries and years, there has been a lot of work that theologians and pastors have tried to do to reconcile Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And this is how this narrative often works out when you hear about it. So, because Genesis 2 is like different, right? I mean, you just on the surface reading it, it's very different. There are some similarities, but it's like, what's going on? These seem to be like two different creation stories, and they actually are, but we'll get to that in a second. But what often happens is that people want to try to harmonize these two. They want to try to pull them together. So this is what will be said. And maybe you've heard this before. People will say, well, Genesis 1 is like the big kind of overarching, creation of everything. And then Genesis 2 is like a look back at day 6, like a zooming in specifically on day 6 to give us some more information about what's going on at that time. I have to break it to you, that's not what's going on. Okay, that's not at all what's happening. Actually, and this is where I'm going to get into bridging the testaments. Actually, okay, spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Spoiler alert. Genesis 2 was written before Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 2 was written centuries before Genesis chapter 1. Now, before you get into like, what? Because we like to think that the Bible was just written like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Instead of like Genesis is a collection of information that has been edited and actually arranged for a certain reason, a specific purpose. So I had heard this theory for a little bit, and actually most recently in the past month, I've heard it twice through two different scholars that I follow in just their passing, talking about how Genesis 2 was written before Genesis 1. And it wasn't until I was spending some time in this book, Bridging the Testaments, that George Athas actually brings out how we know that argument. And I want to look at this here and read to you what he says, because it blew my mind. I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm like highlighting everything and I'm marking in it, and it's just like, what the heck is going on? So this is what he says. Let me see if I can find it. He says, before the Persian era, most people did not think of the gods as existing in another realm. Rather, the gods were part of the universal reality. They possessed supernatural powers, but they were still within the universe. They resided in the divine court of the sky and frequently specific locations on earth, and frequented specific locations on earth, which were deemed sacred by their presence. But from the Persian era on, God came to be seen as a spiritual being who was separate from the one universal reality. And so what he's claiming here, he's making the argument that before the Persian era, I mean, we're talking about here in the mid, like, the Persian era is like between, around the 4s and 5s BCE, 4 and 500 BCE, when the Persians were in control, things began to change in how people thought about God. So he's making the argument that before the Persian era took over, the way that people saw gods was not like how we talk about God today. That was a later development. How people saw gods, and you heard me say it, is that they had supernatural powers, but they were within our universe. They were not outside of our universe. They were part of the reality that we're in. That they would come and visit certain locations on the earth, and those became holy places, in shrines, and temples were built, and altars were built. So they were actually very tangible in how they acted and interacted within the world. And it wasn't until during the Persian era, primarily, he makes the argument, I won't read all of it, but he goes into, he says this development, he says, this developed in the exilic period as we see a new creation account involving God making a stage of muddy soil from which he molds man, in which he plants a garden. God is still within the singular universe in this account, and he walks in the garden, and later descends from the court in the sky to look at the Tower of Babel. And so he's making two connections here, that what you see in Genesis 2 more accurately reflects a time period before the Persian era, when the Israelites were allowed to return back to their homeland. And it's because it reflects like this idea of a tangible God that actually, uses the mud of the ground to mix together and form a human. You have and he makes the other connection in the Tower of Babel, when God says, let us come down and see what they're up to. It's like God enters into the place where the tower is to confuse the language. And so these ways of talking about God are ways that more accurately represent the time period before the Persian kind of era. So then when he says this, he says, but when we turn to Genesis 1 particularly, which was composed during the Persian era, we encountered a transcendent God who is ontologically distinct from creation. And he goes on to say this: in many ways, these ideas were similar to the ones espoused by early Greek philosophers, who theorized that a perfect deity must exist as a distinct being outside perceived reality, but from whom all perceived reality derived. Okay, lot of words there. Essentially, what he's saying here, he's making the argument that the language that we see used about who God is and his actions within the universe in Genesis 1 is a later development of thought in the minds of people about deities that emerged within the Greeks and the Persians about who a God is and how a God exists within time, space, and reality. So I say all that to say this is how we know that we believe that hypothesis, like to know, right? So I'm not gonna speak absolutely here, but this is how we understand the argument that Genesis 1 was written, centuries after Genesis 2. Genesis chapter 2 reflects a more Jewish centered, henotheistic worldview than Genesis chapter 1. And so when you get into that conversation, a couple things you need to understand. Genesis 1 and 2, and I argue this about much all of what I see in the text, is that these are theological pieces of work. Meaning this, that the editors, those who are putting these things together, like the Jewish editors, probably multiple, that chose, when they were putting together the writing Genesis, chose to put the later developed story of creation before the earlier one, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Remember, they didn't have chapters back then, so you got to throw out chapters. It just didn't work like that. So, chapters and verses are a late invention. So how they arranged these, they had these two stories. They had the much earlier Judean centric creation story, and then you had a much later addition with a new lens about who God is that was in their hands. And they decided, for whatever reason, when they were forming the stories of Genesis, to reverse that. That is a theological decision. They are putting these texts together in the arrangement that they have been put in order to make a claim theologically for us to understand. So, all that to say, if you're reading Genesis 1 and 2 scientifically, which causes a breaking of faith in most people's eyes, or even like a literalistic way of reading the text, meaning that everything that these words say had to have happened exactly the way that they were said to happen on the page, you're going to, when you begin to think about your faith, right? When you begin to turn on your brain and actually begin to process what you actually believe about the text and read and study and grow and learn, if a wooden way of approaching those chapters are your way of approaching them, it's really gonna it's really going to break your faith because it's complicated. But if you let go of that way of reading the text and actually begin to read it thematically, it opens you up, not for it to be willy-nilly whatever, because it fits within a certain theme, right? Those are the guardrails. There is a theme in the Bible. That is your guardrail. It doesn't mean that you can just interpret these things to be whatever you want them to be. It means treating the text faithfully, seriously, and honoring the intention of the original author. And within that framework, asking for the wisdom that these sorts of things, these writings have for us today. And the wisdom that I think can be offered to us in the writings of Genesis 1 and 2, read thematically, is this. In moments in my life where I feel like I'm out of control and the world around me is out of hand and out of control, Genesis 1 reminds me that God is a God of order and that his order brings peace and harmony and wholeness to this earth. And Genesis 2 reminds me that God has uniquely crafted me and you to partner with him in actually stewarding that good creation. And so that's the wisdom. That's the invitation. That when I'm in a place where chaos is all around me, I'm reminded that there is a God who brings good order. And that when I partner with him, I can be someone who actually brings order and peace to those around me. That's the invitation and the wisdom of Genesis 1 and 2. And so if you found yourself in a place where you are someone who Genesis has broken your faith because of the way you've read it, and you've had a hard time reconciling these writings with how you understand and see the world today, can I just invite you into a better way to read the Bible that actually doesn't break your faith, but enhances it. Doesn't cause you to turn away from God, but causes you to draw in. This is reading the Bible thematically. All right. That was a lot. Thank you for joining me on this episode. We'll stop it right here. I really appreciate your time and the effort that you're giving just watching these videos. It really means a lot to me. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all the things. Share this if there's someone in your life that you're like, hey, you need to hear this take on Genesis. Share it. Get the word out. Let people know. And if you want more content from me throughout the weeks, make sure to subscribe over at storiesoftov.com. Join our newsletter. You'll get weekly, I'm just saying, thought dumps that'll come into your inbox. There's ways to be a part of this community, contributing, again, being a part of the newsletter. So I just invite you to go to storiesoftov.com, check out all that's over there as well. But thank you for being a part of Whisky and the Writings, being a part of this community, and we will see you next time. Cheers.